Hi, I'm Laserpig. Some time ago, I made a video on the T-14 Armata, where I went over a lot of the public information on the tank and showed that it is a little bit of a Potemkin. The design really shows how in the weeds Russia is when it comes to modern warfare. The tank did not introduce any amount of new technology or ideas over the tanks it claims superiority over. It's extremely large, it's somewhat confusingly designed, and by the time it was revealed to the public, it was already outdated as a concept. Unmanned turret tank designs are not a new thing. As many people stated, the US tried the concept out back in the 80s, and more recently Poland had an unmanned turret design called the PLO-1, and Korea were toying around with the concept some time ago, but there's a reason they didn't go with these designs. I did go over some of them, so I won't repeat myself. But that video did a lot better than expected, and because of that, it got a lot more attention than my videos would typically get, and because of that, it got a lot more attention than I would typically like. A bunch of fans of the T-14 Armata said that I was wrong and that I was talking out of my ass. One even made a video about it. Oh no. My credibility. Oh no. How dare. How dare I probably get things wrong according to that one guy. Gee, I sure hope my other videos are better researched. Alright, let's talk about this. So originally I penned this video for me to be like really angry and sarcastic, but I'm gonna be honest with you, when I first heard about this video, it took me about 2 weeks to finally sit down and watch it. I was scared, obviously I was. There was a flood, actually more like an avalanche of comments from people all being like, haha, this real historian proved you wrong! Everything you said was wrong! So obviously I was expecting this guy to have utterly kicked my ass, and then I sat down and watched it. And honestly, I couldn't help but express disappointment. There was no anger, there was no hate, there was just utter confusion that this is all that it took to convince you. Seriously, RedEffects strawmanning me for half an hour and countering any actual points I made with nuh-uh. That's all it took. That's what you think is real history. This is what you've been begging me to respond to and claiming I didn't do any research and I made so many mistakes. Unsubscribe! Oh, on that note, by the way, there are extensions that allow me to see how long a person has been subscribed. So if you lie or if you are never subscribed, everybody knows. The thing is, I did make some mistakes in that video, and I've apologized for them, and I've removed them from the video. But I didn't make as many mistakes as people think, and RedEffect in his video about my mistakes has ironically made some mistakes of his own, and has used a very carefully chosen arrangement of words to pretend to his audience that I am a lot more wrong without actually saying that I'm wrong. Because I wasn't. Let me give you an example. Now, this is just a small example, okay, just to get us started, so don't accuse me of cherry-picking just yet. In this part, he wants to debunk my claim that the modification of the Kharkiv Model V2 engine, the same engine being used in the World War II era BT-7, is not the engine being used in the T-90. You'll note he never says it wasn't. Modification of the Kharkiv Model V2, the same engine used on the Soviet Second World War era BT-7, though it's more famously for being used in the T-34 and KV series of tanks.
The V2 engine wasn't really designed for BT-7 or vice versa. In fact, BT-7 originally did not even have the V2 engine. It was only the BT-7M that received it, and it was only in 1939 that BT-7M came out, where it was used for testing the engine. And just a couple of months after that, the engine was adopted for T-34 and KV-1 tanks. Yes, BT-7M was accepted into service as well, but as I said already, this engine was not designed for BT-7.
It wasn't designed for the BT-7, true, it was just used for testing. But it was used in the BT-7, so my statement wasn't wrong. Ah, but it was just a prototype, he claims, just an experiment used for testing that was later thrown into service. No, be honest with everyone, RedEffect, it wasn't an experiment used for testing and later adopted into service. They built 790 BT-7s with this engine. It was a mass-produced model, but even if that were true, even if the Kharkiv Model V2 was only ever used in a handful of BT-7s, how does that prove my point wrong? It doesn't. Everything he just said was completely unnecessary and proved absolutely nothing. I didn't make a mistake here, and he didn't correct me on it. He just went on a 10-minute meaningless ramble. And he continues this pretty much throughout the video. Like I said, this was just a small example. Issues of completely ignoring the point I was making, or going off on a straw man, or just overly explaining something where he loops back and eventually agrees with me, but does it in a way that sounds like he's making a point. I mean, quickly, another example, the T90 not being able to fire modern ammunition. I mean, unless you consider the 3MB60 modern ammunition, because it's not modern ammunition, it's ammunition made in the modern day, yes, and I assume it's better than the older ammunition, but it's nowhere near on par with Western ammunition, which is why Russia needed the T-14 to fire the more powerful modern shells, to bring it up to par with the West, which is the point that I was making. I mean, there was literally no reason to bring this up. This is actually a propaganda technique often used by con artists and terrible politicians called flim-flam. The point is to fill your head with enough meaningless logic that your brain starts to glaze over, and you forget what the point is that's being made, or the original argument, and instead simply concentrate on the conclusion when that finally comes around, which can be worded to fool your glazed over mind that a really good point has just been made, and the opponent has just been proved wrong on something, even if you can't quite figure out what that something was. But I wasn't wrong. The T90 does use the same engine that was once used in the BT7, or a modification of it at any rate. Oh, sorry, you're right, not a modification, a further evolution, which is PR business talk for a fucking modification. Ah, but what about the Leo 2 engine? That's from the 70s, he goes on. Oh great, another wonderful argumentative fallacy. Whataboutism. Brilliant. Yes, the engine is from the 70s because that's when they built the Leopard 2. It's a tank from the 70s, upgraded to modern standards. It's getting a little bit past its best, that's why they're looking to replace it. But you're right, it is an old engine. But if they were using the 12-cylinder Maybach HL210 P45 from the Tiger tank, I'd be a bit worried. But again, that was not the point I was making here. But of course the V2 and the T90 is absolutely not the same engine, according to the Russian propaganda, and when they have to admit that it actually is, because it's a huge point of pride for the Kharkiv factory that made it, and it is a major point in their history, they immediately proclaim, but yes, it's such a perfect and revolutionary design that it's still valid, even today. And I love how RedEffects plays this video over his narration, like he's implying that these are all the parts that have slowly been replaced and added over the years. They're not. The most they have done to the Kharkiv Model V2 was supercharge the hell out of it. It's a modification of the same engine. It looks prettier, yes. It's maybe got some plastic covers where metal used to be, but I'd expect that. If Russia was still making engines to World War II standards, I'd be worried. But you can't claim it's a completely different engine just because you've put a plastic cover over it. But even if it wasn't the same World War II engine, again, that wasn't the point. The point of that particular argument wasn't the engine is from World War II. I may have focused on that for comedic effect, but the point was that the engine has reached the limit of what it is capable of technologically through upgrades and modifications quite some time ago, and that the T90 is underperforming because of it, and that Western designs far exceed it in capability, in spite of what should have been an obvious advantage that the T90 should have in terms of maneuverability and speed. Instead, it's operating on par with tanks multiple tons heavier than it, which means in order to achieve the same speed, it has to be lighter, which means it cannot afford to have the same level of equipment and protection as Western designs. Red ignores this and instead strawmans me, making up an entirely new argument and debating on me from there, using loaded language to imply that I've made a mistake, where in fact I haven't, avoiding directly having to state that I'm wrong so that what he says is technically true, but only superficially seems to counter my arguments, where in reality it proves nothing. And this is basically Red's video in a nutshell. He glosses over the flaws of Russian tanks, obscures the points that I'm trying to make, and replaces it with a half-truth that is technically true, but not the point. To give you another example, and to continue on from the point I made earlier, that part where I'm comparing the speed of the Challenger 2 to the T90, and he's like, that's not how you measure speed. Tanks never go their full speed on the battlefield. It's all about acceleration.
Both T90 and Challenger 2 have a maximum speed of 60 km per hour, but that is not really the correct way to measure the speed of a tank. Sure, maximum speed matters, but it does not matter nearly as much as acceleration.
Not the point. The point was the Challenger 2 is 20 tons heavier than the T90 and can go the same speed. A much lighter tank should be able to run rings around the Challenger 2, not match it. And he does this again with the Arjun, confusing its original 70s program with the more recent announcements on its upgrades and redevelopment, ignoring all the critique of the T90 that has come out of India in recent years. He does it again with the Abrams engine, where he repeats the fuel consumption myth, and so on and so forth. And when he can't think of a point to make, he simply parrots the lines of Russian propaganda. For example, the claim that the T-14 which broke down on the practice parade was just a driver engaging the emergency brake is not really true. Russia was so embarrassed about this incident in the documentary about the T-14, they bring it up 3 times. What Red has forgotten, of course, is when we only had this footage, Russia claimed that this was all part of the performance, that the T-14 had stopped deliberately as part of a rehearsal in case it happened on the real day, and they had to actually tow away a broken down tank. They even announced this to the crowd via loudspeaker, and it was reported in all the Russian newspapers the following day, until this video emerged, in which this towing vehicle is trying to move the Armata and clearly having trouble, and then the story about the emergency brake starts getting reported. Does the Armata actually have an emergency brake? How easy is it to confuse the brake with all the other controls? How hard is it for a full team of engineers in what I can only describe as a gaggle of officers to not notice the brake is on? Does the Armata share a similar trait of other Russian tanks where the final drive has to be disconnected before it can be towed? Any of you consider any of these things? No? That's actually a pretty good example of how modern Russian propaganda works. They've really noticed people love to say, well, actually, that gotcha moment that's going to wipe the smirk off the face of someone telling you what is and what isn't. So Russian propaganda bots masquerade as legit-sounding news websites like Democracy Now! Or East Asia Times or Local Times news reports, and then use that to post their edited version of events. Now, you don't read stuff like Democracy Now! You've probably never heard of it, but you will have noticed the story if it came up on your Twitter or Facebook feed, or if it was posted on some obscure subreddit you hang around in, or if some guy in a forum just happened to mention it, or as what typically happens, the YouTuber you get your news from used it as a source. You won't remember it came from Democracy Now! Newsreport.biz, but you will remember that little gotcha, and you'll carry it around with you until you proudly get to use it. Well, actually, it was just a driver error. The tank didn't break down. But of course, I forget, you're too smart for that, aren't you? You're immune to propaganda, aren't you? In Russia, the truth is whatever they dictate it to be, and if you say otherwise, then God help you. The developers of Company of Heroes 2 are still facing arrest if they ever enter Russia or a Russian allied territory for their portrayal of Soviet war crimes during the Second World War.
Nevertheless, I will tell you why the game plot campaign is full of shit, how Relic desecrates the history of countries alien to them, and why I refer to game scriptwriters as Nazis.
In fact, there are laws in place in Russia which forbid the portrayal of the Great Patriotic War as anything but noble and heroic, and in modern times, anyone who questions the legitimacy of Putin or the 3-day special military operation in Ukraine faces arrest. Famously, a small girl was arrested and placed into foster care with her father under house arrest and facing prison time for drawing something anti-war in school. That is how seriously Russia takes these things. Even the developers of World of Tanks are wanted by the FSB for refusing to support the war in Ukraine, which is why I've been so willing to give them and World of Warships so many shoutouts and ads at a relatively discounted rate. It's also a fairly enjoyable game. So you can imagine how tense the situation must be for Russian war bloggers and commentators. No one in Russia is going to admit the T-14 is a failure and risk arrest. No one is going to say the tank has engine problems or that the engine is derived from an old Nazi design. As far as everyone is concerned, it's a brilliant tank, it just needs a little bit more testing, and they have been developing X engine since the 70s. The engine is a totally new design, and the fact that it uses a lot of the same unconventional design elements as the SLA-16, an engine they captured 5 intact examples of, as well as all the plans and engineers who built them, is purely coincidental. So when the generals and engineers are interviewed, this is what they tell the press, and the bloggers, who live in a world where they can no longer critique the power of Russian military might, have to toe that line of being decisively positive or neutral, and can only repeat what the press is being told. And being that RedEffects gets pretty much all his information from these blogs, he unintentionally just ends up parroting Russian propaganda. I say unintentionally because I'm being nice. Red is not an idiot. There is a level of comprehension behind what he says most of the time, but Red is a person who is very well known in the community for relying heavily on Soviet sources, which have led him to make some very questionable claims. He is typically hypercritical of every aspect of Western armor, but tends to gloss over the flaws of anything Russian or Soviet in design. His critique of the Challenger 2 strikes a particular chord with me, especially when he claimed the frontal lower plate could be penetrated by World War II era guns.
For a long time, Challenger 2 had problems with the protection of the lower front plate. The lower front plate is only 60mm thick, which means that it can be penetrated even by World War II guns.
And ignore the fact that this area was always intended to house explosive reactive armor. Even in its first deployments in Kosovo, you can see these massive ERA blocks on the front. That was intentional. ERA was the big thing. It allowed the tank to be much lighter and cheaper, and the Brits love cheap shit. Now, of course, it's not there anymore because it's been replaced by the same Mark I Dorchester armor as everything else, so no, a World War II gun could not penetrate that. So I'm sorry to say this to any Red Effect fans, but this is not the gotcha that people think it is. This is a very poorly researched video that has been presented exceptionally dishonestly, and though I am trying to be nice here, you can sit there and tell me you are not doing this for the attention all you want. You could say to people that you don't mind if people watch my content, it just isn't your cup of tea, or you're not really here to discredit my entire channel, I still make good content, whatever. When you put my image on the screen with a giant red letter wrong on the forehead, regardless of what you claim your intentions are, that is bait. That is clickbait. Maybe not specifically against me, but certainly against my audience. And I don't appreciate people fucking with my fans. We are all aware of how much attention, how much subscribers, and how much money you can get in a YouTuber clout war. And I'm not a person to rise to that challenge. I don't care. I don't want 1 billion subscribers and a mansion in the Hollywood Hills with an ensuite Ferrari and a masturbation planetarium. I've got my own little corner, and I'm happy with it. So if this is what you're after, choose a different target. I'm not interested in a YouTuber clout war, which is why it has taken me so long to respond to this and why I typically don't respond to critique in general. And it's why, even if Red makes another follow-up video or whatever, I don't care. I'm not responding. I didn't even want to make this video in the first place. I'm just getting tired of repeating myself. Because the truth of the matter is, even if everything Red said was correct, does that make the T-14 a good tank? No, it doesn't. It's still an overpriced, archaic piece of shit that is yet to make any significant combat debut outside of a token appearance and the Russian DoD saying, yes, it's 100% out there in Ukraine doing something, trust us. The Russian army still cite engine issues and claim a lot of the systems on board don't work as intended, and they have refused to accept it into service. It remains a private project in testing. But I don't want to dunk on RedEffects too much because he's actually a decent guy, and as I said earlier, I wasn't even really planning to address this. I was going to wait till after the war when more information on the T-14 was available and reach out to the guy and ask if he wants to work on a joint project, share brain cells. But the thing is, his rebuttal of me was one of his more successful videos. He got a lot of clicks, and some other YouTubers decided, hey, there's money to be made here. Oh boy, I wonder where I'm going with this. This is Cone of Arc, a YouTuber whose view numbers have been lacking lately. Thanks to being flooded with comments, Cone got angry and went on a rant where he talked about how the engine from the T-14 Armata is not the one from the Porsche Tiger, it may in fact be the one from the Yak Tiger. And as you may be aware, which of the over-related, unreliable and generally useless tanks the Soviets pulled the SLE-16 engine out of is the single most important fact in history and utterly changes the entire context of the video. This is why it was so important that this YouTuber called me out and imply that I am a liar, an idiot, and a purveyor of disinformation in front of his entire fan base. So I'm sorry, I guess this YouTuber noticed I got the name of the tank wrong. Except I didn't. Because if we look at the blog he got these pictures of the SLE-16 engine from, it actually talks about how the engine started life as an engine for the Porsche Tiger. Alright, the Mark II, not the Mark I. Porsche believed that air-cooled diesel engine Tigers would strongly benefit the desert campaign, but because the tank was cancelled, the target tank for this engine was switched to something else. One was installed into a Yak Tiger, which was later captured by the Soviets. So you're right, you needed to call me out on that because of all those comments you got from my fans spreading disinformation. All 3 of them. Did you forget I can check? But hey, you're right, it's really important that these 3 people learn that it was the Yak Tiger the engine came from, not anything else. Except, that's not quite true. In fact, would it surprise you to learn this entire blog post and subsequently almost all the information about the SLE-16 engine posted online is complete bullshit? Well, no, that wouldn't be fair to say complete bullshit, but there is a fair bit wrong with it. This article from warspot.ru, which is what RedEffects is using as a source, which he thinks is better than the other warspot.ru I'm sourcing because it has sources listed. Of course, I'm sure I don't need to explain that this is what would be considered a primary source, talking about current events, so it doesn't need to cite sources, whereas this is a secondary source talking about history, so it does. Those first two sources listed, by the way, those are LiveJournal posts, both of whom were co-authored by the same guy who wrote this blog, and links back to this article, which may have been written by the same guy back in 2011 on VK.com. VK.com is basically the Russian Facebook, so the source of the source is a Facebook post by himself. A very pure spray of him. Anyway, the only source they cite which seems to talk about the SLA-16 is Professor Porsche's Wars by Carl Ludvigsen. Here's my copy, of which they seem to have used just for the pictures. In the book, Ludvigsen explains how the engine came to be, how Albert Speer refused to take Porsche seriously, and how Simmering was brought in to help Porsche make a new engine to be the modular do-anything engine for whatever tank was the Nazi buzzword of the day. Misquotes from this book have made it into almost every blog that has ever spoken about the SLA-16, hence why what tank it was designed for changes depending on who you ask, from the Tiger II to the Maus to the Low and beyond. Essentially, whatever tank Hitler thought was going to win the war this week. 5 engines were completed, and 1 was installed onto a King Tiger, not as Art claims, a Yak Tiger.
But yes, Laserpig, we do know what they mean by hunting tiger. Seriously, man, do some actual research.
The claims for this were made by the other co-author of those LiveJournal posts. In another LiveJournal post, he disputes that the SLA-16 could never fit into King Tiger by cross-referencing the engine bay of the King Tiger with the engine plans, showing it couldn't possibly fit. He seems to have done this at around the same time the torture game for tank nerds War Thunder released a new premium version of the King Tiger with the SLA-16 engine, claiming proudly that War Thunder was wrong and it was a Yak Tiger instead. He cites no sources for this. In actuality, according to the book that everyone is claiming as a source, the SLA-16 was installed onto a King Tiger that had been very easily modified to accept it, which makes War Thunder correct. There's a sentence I never thought I'd say. But say you're an idiot who's just skimming the book and looking at the pictures. You would maybe not see that line and instead see this mock-up diagram of the engine installed onto a Yak Tiger, not even bothering to read the caption. The Russians would presumably capture this King Tiger along with a factory in Vienna where 5 working examples stood intact.
I understand that the T-14 being a newer vehicle makes it harder to research as less information is declassified about it, but that does not excuse lazy sourcing. We all make errors from time to time, but it is your responsibility as a creator who is making edutainment style content to make sure that information is as accurate as possible.
When it comes to a lot of the critique that I get, it's typically made by people who almost exclusively do all their research online, and there is this huge, and I mean huge, disconnect between the information you get online versus what you find published in more academic sources, by which I don't mean LiveJournal. So if you do all your research online, like Cone and Red do, you inevitably end up repeating false information or falling victim to woozles. Now, of course, the big question is that engine that was in the King Tiger the same one that was in the Armata? Here's the thing, I don't know. After a lot of back and forth, I can honestly say that no one can really answer for definite yes or no. The information we have on this engine is scarce at best, and is wrapped in multiple layers of speculation and conjecture. Most of it comes from blogs who have written half-truths and guesswork as blatant fact, or other bloggers who have come along and built it up from there. Researching anything to do with this engine is an absolute nightmare. Even the Tank Museum admitted a lot of the information about the tank itself was speculative and maybe propaganda, but even they admitted the engine is a copy of the German SLA-16, and they have way more resources than I do.
UVZ, Russia's main tank manufacturer, in a much hyped action, took an engine called the A85-3 that was a copy of a German egg-shaped engine from the war years. The Transdiesel Design Bureau had originally offered the engine as a unit for compressor, oil and gas pumping stations.
You'll note Red and Cone don't critique that video. I get it, we all want to go to Tankfest. David Williams is an actual historian, not a dirty YouTuber with alcoholism and anger management issues, so I'm the easier target, obviously. Which is true, I don't move very fast. I'm a big boy and it's very hot right now. I'm like a hippo, I move faster when it rains. So when it comes to the reality of is this an engine a copy of the SLA-16, the answer is probably yes. Obviously, it wouldn't be fair to call it a direct copy because it has been modified, further evolved from that original 1945 design. This obviously gets seized on by the Vacniks because any evidence that the engine has been modified, even if it's just a different colour, is obvious evidence that it's not the same engine, blah blah blah, etc etc, whine whine whine. But I want to explain why I have reached that probably yes conclusion, so this is all the information I could find on the SLA-16, by which I mean my Patreons were pulling stuff out of archives, we were ordering weird books, we were reading through old newspapers, I had my 2 remaining contacts in Russia dig around to see what they could find. Essentially, we did a lot of research. We did as much as we could, and on that point, we did a lot more research than any of these blogs, or RedEffects, or Cone have done.
Seriously, man, do some actual research.
So I'm not going to list my sources because if they want to critique me on what I found, if you want to critique me on what I found, I want both you and them to go through the same level of research and the same level of pain that me and the 2 people who agreed to help me also went through, because I have a sneaking suspicion that they won't. Actual history is not just reading a blog. The thing is, the Treble Instructor Factory have done a fairly good job at rewriting the history of the engine. They are keeping its development very, very close to their chest. But prior to 2014, the Russian military were adamant that X engines were pointless and that they would never develop one. They considered it a technological dead end, and to a point, they are right. X engines are not popular and are very rarely used in the modern age due to the design simply being overcomplicated and prone to excessive wear. In fact, when one was presented to the Russians back in 2013, they ignored it. And there was even talk from even as far back as 2009 about the proposal of purchasing a license to build German engines for future tanks. Of course, this has all changed now. So here's what we do know and why I think probably yes. After the war, there's a lot of talk in both Britain and America about the engine. There's a few newspaper articles that pop up, and there seems to be some excitement that this revolutionary new design is about to hit the market. America even manages to obtain one and test it out. We have a report for that here. Unfortunately, it is a little damaged, but we do get some very nice torque lines. Oh, look at those. After that, the engine just sort of vanishes. All materials relating to the SLA-16 program are handed over to a company called Transdiesel. Now, Transdiesel make a lot of engines for different reasons, including for the military. And at some point in the 60s, a 16-valve X-diesel engine matching the configuration of the SLA-16 shows up as a potential for the engine of the T-64. It's developed by a bunch of students working for Transdiesel, and to try and make it fit, they knocked it from 16 cylinders down to 12. The army rejected it, and development of the engine further was forbidden. It shows up again in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, this time as an engine for a tank called Object 477. Now, information on this tank is incredibly limited. It was a Ukrainian design which paralleled the T-95 somewhat. Supposedly, information on it was discovered by British spies. Again, I have no idea how much truth is in that. I've asked the Ukrainians for more information, but they have better things to worry about right now, and I've not received a reply. They were supposedly developing this tank concept for future use, but it didn't seem to go anywhere. I mean, obviously the T-84 does not have an X engine. It was proposed and apparently trialled in the T-95, but again, information, or should I say reliable information on the T-95 is scarce. Hence why so many people, including myself, just don't believe it ever existed outside of a money pit and a mock-up. Now we sort of get into more recent history. It shows up again in the 2000s, this time for sale as a pumping station engine. This may seem weird, and I know Red was like, no, it was exclusively developed for use in tanks. Shut up. The X engine was called the A85-3, and it showed up as a pumping station engine. Transdiesel were facing bankruptcy, and they were literally just throwing everything they had out there to whomever would want to buy an engine. Transdiesel engines show up in tractor exhibits, mining machine exhibits, you name it. The A85-3 was very similar to the 12-cylinder diesel engine we saw back on the T-64 program. It got no interest. In 2013, it shows up again, this time at a closed exhibition of Russian future military equipment at Nizingi Tigel? There. This time it's labelled the 12N3060. Some work appears to have been done to its lubrication system with the inclusion of a dry sump system. It got absolutely no interest other than a passing mention in a government-controlled newspaper called there. The thing is, at this time, the Russians had a new tank program. It didn't have a name at this point, it was simply called the modernized T-90S. But most likely, that was the tank we now know as the Armata. It may have been the Burlak, but that used a T-80 hull as a base, and according to the Gazette, this looked absolutely nothing like anything they'd ever seen before, so I don't think it was the Burlak. But for whatever reason, the unnamed possibly Armata did not raise heads. But a year later, a new Armata is shown off, and that has our A85-3 as its engine. What had happened in between is allegedly this modernized T90S was having engine issues. Euro were contracted to make a new engine because obviously sanctions meant buying one from the Germans was no longer a possibility. And all that money that had been given to Euro to develop this engine just kind of mysteriously disappeared. But by a striking coincidence, when Transdiesel went bankrupt, it was Euro that bought them out, and they purchased with them designs for the A85-3. So when they needed a new engine and people started asking uncomfortable questions about where all the development money went, suddenly, out of nowhere, the new chosen design, the Armata, has this incredibly powerful X12 diesel engine which shares a striking similarity to the one that was developed for the T64 and remarks a number of innovations that seem to be very similar to the SLE16, except this time they're the proud innovations of Russian engineering, and the technology was never a dead end, and the Russians have been developing X engines since the 1970s, blah blah blah, whatever. Frankly, I don't believe them, and I've got enough just cause to fully believe they are lying and have every reason to lie. And honestly, if you've been following the Ukraine war and you're not one of the people sucking Vacnic cock, you've probably noticed that Russia does lie quite a lot. So I am pretty confident our SLE16, though a little modified, is the engine the Armata is currently using. In fact, I'm so confident I'd be willing to put money on it. So if you know otherwise, you better let me know immediately, because I got money riding on this. Me and Digi are going to Vegas next year, so I'm going to need that money. But the one thing you have to remember from all of this is nothing on my channel has triggered the Vacniks quite as hard as this video. Annoyingly, just being labelled as disgusting Western propaganda by Russia doesn't entitle you to any tax breaks or any sort of monetary compensation from NATO. I mean, they could at least send me a mug, a pen, mouse mat, maybe that'd be nice, but no, I get nothing. Absolutely nothing. Which confuses the Vacniks, because how else could we possibly disagree with them? They know the real truth, they're smart, they couldn't possibly be wrong, so anyone who disagrees must secretly know that they are right, but have ulterior motives to pretend otherwise, which obviously must be money. And if it's not money, then, well, I guess I'm just stupid. Or if I'm not, then I must be, by default, evil. Well, the thing is, they are wrong. But the good thing is, by observing their behavior, you kind of get a rough idea of what is going on in the minds of Russian propaganda, because Russia, and Russians in general, are very bad at being able to take things on the chin. They just can't let things go. They cannot just laugh shit off. You'll note whenever I critique Russian stuff, it really sets them off. Nothing else does this. If this video had been about the Leclerc and I'd gotten absolutely everything wrong, people like Red wouldn't have given half a shit. God, it's going to be really hard for them if I ever make that AK-47 video. But you and me, vaguely mature idiots, if we make a mistake, like when I called Ground Radar Fleur back in my A10 video and people pointed out and laughed, you learn to laugh with them. You learn to admit you did the funny and everyone moves on with their life because only a child or a true narcissist gets offended at stuff like that and strikes out. But in Russia, those are fighting words, especially in the government where any slight becomes a full-on war. Trying to explain the school playground style politics of the Kremlin is a rabbit hole. Just imagine a room full of power-hungry individuals with vast egos and childlike mentalities whose singular method of surviving is not to make things work and prove they are the best person to make things work, but to keep everyone from finding out that it isn't working, while at all times presenting the image that not only is it working as planned, but it is working so well that every other nation around the world is shocked and jealous. So pointing out that it doesn't work is the single most offensive thing you can do, because you've just blown the masquerade and now the gloves are off. Welcome to being public enemy number one, because the only response to having their lies pointed out is to scream so loudly and attack you back so fiercely that everyone immediately forgets what you just said and settles in to watch the drama. And if you lose that fight, then well, you were clearly wrong to begin with. This is how Russian politics work in a nutshell. Everyone is doing such a bad job, they are pretending to be doing such a great job that they never point out the errors of others, because by doing so, that person can now point out your errors. And if you've pissed anyone else off, or if they have a lot of friends, they are all going to jump on the bandwagon and start shouting at you. So it's best maybe just to keep your mouth shut until that person makes such a catastrophic error, it cannot be hidden. And then you can make your move. And no, you can't get around this by doing a good job and making everything work well, because then you'll be seen as competent. and competent people are threatening, so everyone will just gang up on you. So by watching the Vatniks strike out and listening to what they are most angry at, you get a good idea of what Russia is trying to distract you from. And as I said earlier, nothing has triggered them quite like the T-14 video. And I've just been leaning on the philosophy of let them cook, because at the time of recording, there is no visual evidence that any T-14s have seen combat. There aren't any T-14s in mass production as far as I'm aware, and based on all the information I found out about it, the good and the bad, it's not some groundbreaking magical super tank, it's a somewhat poor attempt to bring Russia up to current Western standards. It has still not been adopted into service by the army. None of the countries who were offered it as export wish to purchase it, and its teething issues going back nearly a decade now still have not been resolved. They are, of course, completely free to prove me wrong, and I'll be hanging out in the War Thunder form when they're ready. So, let me rewind on this a little bit. Look, I know I have a habit of coming across as exceptionally smug, but here's the thing. Laserpig is a character I've created. He's bold, he's arrogant, he's egotistical, he doesn't suffer fools, but the guy behind Laserpig, me, is a very quiet and very reserved person. I don't usually like attention, so don't judge me on the pig is big ego arrogance, because he's not really. He's doing that for comedic effect, and I love all the people who are like, oh, he's a funny man, not serious, can't be a great source of history, because I think in their mind, unless you're sitting at your desk just stating facts in a dry voice with B-roll going on in the background, then you're not really a historian, which is like the most bizarre argument I've ever heard. Like, I grew up on horrible history. That's how I got into history in the first place, which is a sort of attempt to be entertaining while talking about historical events without really straying into that coffee table train station bookstore side of things, where it's like an elite special team of men do man things, being men, and they blow up the bridge and be men while doing dat bait, that used to be called, but I know that term now means something else. So, the Horrible Histories is really good. I mean, they're not 100% factually accurate. I would maybe avoid reading their book on the American Revolution unless you really want to see a British historian try and justify the Boston Massacre. I mean, I would give that one a miss. Thing is, I come from that school of thought that history should be entertaining. Because if you're entertaining, if you're funny, people listen to you. That was like one of the first things I noticed at social gatherings and things when I was younger. When I tried to, actually everyone, and go on these long rambles, no one wanted to talk to me. No one even wanted to listen to what I had to say. But if I laughed and then told them a funny historical story, people would listen to what I said. And then they'd tell their friends, and then I'd show up at another party and people would be like, hey, you're the guy that told the funny story. And I'd be like, yeah. And they'd want to hear more. And that's kind of like why my style of video is the way it is. I don't want to sit there and spitball dry facts at you. I want to be entertaining. I want you to want to hear what I have to say and then tell your friends, and hopefully by that process we start breaking up the narratives that have defined the common understanding of history. You know, the honourable SS officer, the clean Wehrmacht, all that bullshit peddled by the fighter mafia back in the day. And you know, it does warm my heart quite a lot when people were talking, like in the Whitman video, how they did history courses and they were taught to be critical of primary sources. And I love that. I'm so happy that my experiences are not universal, but maybe that's because my experiences were all around dealing with that core of stuffy British old conservative level of historians that made it all big in the 70s and 80s and just not having time for this pubescent child questioning their research. So being taught to be critical of primary sources is a good first step, and I'm so happy that it's happening. The next step is getting these people to write books or start YouTube channels where they question these sources as opposed to falling back into the narrative. And hopefully, if we are lucky, that starts to rub off on the public who might finally learn to think critically, because if people can think critically, we wouldn't be in half the shit we are in now. Anyway, I'm rambling. I'm sorry. The point is, I know I don't know everything. I'm a decent historian, I think, but I'm not one of the greats. I do make mistakes. We all do. And I know I make mistakes. I'm normally the first person to put my hand up and say, hey, I made a boo-boo. And the mistakes I make are always like stupid little things like mistranslations or mispronunciations. It just happens. But I do my own research. I do a lot of research. People all the time get angry at me for the length of time it takes for me to produce one video, but this is the reality. I'm a one-man show and it takes me a long time to do the research that I need to do. I mean, the Whitman video was meant to come out the 25th of June. Instead, it didn't come out till late July because I kept finding more stuff that warranted more research, and I think my boyfriend can testify the amount of times I was up to like 3 and 4 a.m. just reading stuff. And it was the same for the T14 video. I mean, I did a lot of research on the vehicle. It wasn't a spite video or a work of Ukrainian propaganda. It was genuinely what I believed to be true. And outside of a few translation issues which I've corrected in the video, I still believe I got it right. And RedEffect agreed with me on that. I mean, he starts the video by saying he thinks I got about 90% of it right. The thing is, I am maybe being a little unfair on RedEffect. I'm probably being unfair on Cone as well, but he was so rude to me that I couldn't care less, if I'm honest. Red is kind of right in the sense that we are both reading online blogs and taking it from there, because in terms of the T14 Armata, there isn't any primary sources that can tell us what is and what isn't. It's all conjecture. But as someone who has been around tanks pretty much their entire life, who's been around people who have worked on and in tanks, who have helped design them, I've got people who worked on the Abrams X, the Challenger 3 chatting away with me. I count among my friends tank historians, former tank crews, even people like my ex-boyfriend who was the driver of a T-72 and later a T-90. I've even had the chance to talk to the commander of a battalion of light tanks. I've had the chance to talk to some Ukrainian tankers and the difficulties they face. So I feel that I can make an observational analysis of the information we have. Yeah, I read these blogs, but I'm reading between the lines. I'm collecting them all together, I'm seeing what the overall opinion is, what the press are saying, what the journals are saying, even just down to the body language of the people who were interviewed, or just how staged everything appears to be in the documentary. That all says something, it all means something. There's a reason I put all these things down as references/sources, because I'm not really sourcing them, I'm more just referencing them. And I don't feel that RedEffect is doing that. I feel like he's taking whatever these blogs say at their word and is just being really dishonest in his approach to sort of make it look like he's being more critical of me to sort of appease that semi-Vatnik tanky part of his community that were all urging him to bring the pig down. I mean, there's even this point where I'm talking about the top speed of the T90, and he's like, it's 50 miles an hour, not 30. But I'm talking about off-road speed of the T90, which is about 30 odd miles an hour. On-road, it could maybe do 50 on a good day, and I even addressed that later on in the video. But, I mean, someone posted on Reddit a list of all the stuff he got wrong just on Western tanks. And that's not because he doesn't know about Western tanks, it's because those are the Russian propaganda lines about what is wrong with Western tanks, which is why he thinks those things. The thing is, I mean, yes, neither of us are really qualified to be making this call, but the thing is, who is? It's such a hand-wavy argument. Oh, you're not qualified to talk about it. Well, neither are you. You're not qualified to even judge who is qualified or not. I mean, is the Tank Museum qualified to talk about the T-14? Their work is built upon the work of historians and former British tank crews, not Russian tankers and the designers at Ural. Is the Chieftain qualified? He was the commander of an Abrams. Surely anything outside the field of how to command an Abrams is not his expertise. These people are not falling back on some paper diploma and talking out of their ass because they are now magically qualified to know everything. They're using their knowledge and their skills to critically analyze the best information we have, and oftentimes find out that information to begin with. Qualified people do this as well, and the diploma just proves they've done it before at an academic institutional level. This is what all historians do. It's analytics, it's cross-referencing, it's thinking critically, it's investigation, and I'm confident enough in my own knowledge and in my own skills and in my own research and the conclusions that I've come to that I don't feel the need to argue with every pisspot on Reddit who thinks otherwise. And don't even get me started on the people who think their opinion matters more because it's not posted on Reddit. There's no hierarchy of internet asshole opinions. Get a fucking grip, okay? But you know, who knows? Maybe when the T-14 finally makes its debut, it'll be the most amazing tank ever made and it'll truly shock the West. Somehow I doubt it, but I am willing to be proven wrong.